Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy where we talk about some of the most pressing issues facing HR professionals and business leaders. From fair treatment of employees to fostering transparency in the workplace, we'll explore how to create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to. So, if you're feeling blue, tune in and join the conversation so you don't end up with a case of the Mondays.
Welcome to another Reflections episode of A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy, a pay and reward consultancy where we help our clients attract and retain the best talent through pay transparency. My name is Rameez Karim, your podcast host, and in our Reflections episode today, we're talking about succession planning. In this month's episode, I spoke to Mustafa Jaffer, who's the Global Head of Talent at Standard Chartered Bank, a global organization with around 90,000 employees. And today I'm joined by my colleagues from the Reward team, Tracy Hodgson and Philippa Nisbet. We all worked in HR and more specifically within Reward, both in-house and obviously now in consultancy. But succession planning is not something that you hear about as much as other areas of HR, such as reward or recruitment, learning and development. So, Tracy, I'll start with you. Why do you think that is the case? Why is this something which feels a really critical part of, and hopefully people who've heard the podcast around everything that Standard Chartered and Mustafa said that they were doing, why is this something that doesn't get talked about more often, do you think?
So I think it's something that's more common in larger organisations, maybe because they've got the capacity or the resources to focus on succession planning. But also they may feel that they've got the opportunities within their structure to prepare their employees for the next roll up, whereas we have a number of clients that are a much smaller size and they're constantly talking about not having the next progression step for employees, and employees having to leave to get the next progression in their career because of the positions above not leaving. So that doesn't happen as much in larger organizations. So I think they're then able to create a succession planning process that maybe some of the smaller organizations think they can't do, but actually they probably can, because what you just said, reward, L&D, recruitment, all of those are elements of succession planning.
I agree. I think it's something that is not defined as succession planning. I think it is something a lot of organisations do naturally, understanding the workforce, understanding where the skills are, understanding the leadership. They just might not look at it as succession planning. It's just not the label they use.
Do you think that when you say, and we hear this a lot from organizations to say, well, we just don't have that progression available in our organization. And there's a lot of recruitment that goes on in a lot of these organizations. And do you think that we're always just thinking of our roles as very defined and this is what we've hired them for and this is what they can do in terms of um, and hence there's less internal mobility and movement. And so whenever there is a vacancy, instead of us first thinking internally to say, are some of these skills transferable? And it might be better for us to move somebody internally, because one of the things that stuck with me when I was speaking to Mustafa was he said, whenever they have a vacancy, their priority is always, can we fill this internally somehow? And if they can't, then only then they go out for recruitment. And obviously, even if you fill it internally, you might have another recruitment position to fill, but it's about growth, development. And when you have that movement internally, you're more likely to retain people because then somebody's in a new job and they're more likely to stay there for a while rather than look to move externally.
I think my main takeaway was that the culture that Mustafa's working within is very geared to that growth mindset. You've got that concept of you're with us and we will develop you and you will get that access to the next step in your career, or, you know, sideways step if it's a transferable skill. And I think that that is something that doesn't happen in every organization because they just don't have that culture. It takes time to pull together sort of the little pieces that will help people feel developed and understand that the internal candidate would be a preferable option to an external candidate. So that's where you see things like refer a friend. You get a lot of, you know, it's not succession planning defined, but you've got people bringing in those who are you've got the right, you know, cultural fit rather than getting the, you know, you're growing someone up to a senior position rather than hiring externally.
So my favourite takeaway actually from Mustafa was build, buy, borrow. And I thought that was a really good way of looking at it. And what we're finding with quite a number of organisations, because when they're coming
Can
to us
you
with
can you explain
reward,
that? Can you explain what
so
that build, buy,
so
borrow
the
is?
build, so the build is obviously that internal, growing the talent internally and building them up to the next levels. Buy is the recruitment, it's buying in the skills that you need. And then borrow, which was I thought was really interesting, was seeing if there is somebody else internally who can help you with like certain aspects of a vacancy or a project or a piece of work, seeing if there's somebody else in the organisation who could have got some capacity to take that on. And then that obviously gives that person then some exposure to another part of the business, another area. So we just go back to the buy bit. I think the buy bit is where we're getting a lot of noise because that's the recruitment bit, and that's where they're panicking because they haven't got the skills in house, and then they're trying to find it on the market, and the market doesn't necessarily have what they're looking for because they almost want somebody to have the knowledge of their organisation and sector plus a skill that they're missing. And yeah, if they actually build somebody up, then they wouldn't have to worry about that kind of sector knowledge or that some of that niche knowledge from the market. But yeah, the borrow bit I thought was really interesting because I think there's a real opportunity there with a lot of organisations to work on that borrow piece, because that is really looking at that transferable skills element.
Yeah, like a secondment.
Yeah, it could be a secondment, or literally it could be a project that takes 1 day a week, 2 days a week. I mean, if you think about the start of your conversation with Mustafa, and you were talking about your careers and how you went from an economics degree to coming into HR, it was a case of exposure to lots of different types of work and functions to see where you wanted your careers to go. And I think that can still take place throughout someone's career. It doesn't need to be at that graduate stage. It could be at any stage in their career life cycle.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's we tend to have a lot of jobs that are very defined and very specific in what they do, and you don't really go outside of that boundary. You know, if you take reward as an example, what we do, if you look at that in a lot of large financial services firms or banks, you are doing very specific things. You could have somebody that is their only job is completing salary surveys throughout the
Yeah.
year, and you don't get exposure to lots of other areas. And is it because, you know, one of the things that we always say when we talk about 3R strategies, we talk about attracting and retaining the best talent. And it feels like a lot of organizations have a lot more focus on the attraction and less so on the retention, because all of these things, I think, help more with your retention. And again, coming back to pay, if you think of an example where, we have a budget of 3%, 4%, and we'll stick with that budget for what we're willing to pay people to retain them. But if you're having an interview process and somebody tries to negotiate a 20% pay rise, we'll quite happily pay that. And so again, it feels like there is a lot more focus on the attraction and getting people in. But once they're in, it's it's like when you get a phone contract or a TV contract. Once you're a customer, then you're no longer paying the lowest prices. Get taken for granted, and it feels like sort of similar in some organizations with employees. Is once you've joined us, we've done our bit. Now let's focus on bringing the new people in.
Yeah, agreed. That's why when you're looking at succession planning, it's usually tied in with the recruitment strategy and with the learning and development strategy. And you tend to see it more in organizations where they struggle to fill certain skill sets. So they bring in apprentices and the goal is to grow that skill set. You don't see it so much in organizations where there's much more of that transaction. There's an expectation. People leave after 2 years. There's an expectation. You'll have to reacquire that talent. So it's, again, goes back to that culture. Are you expecting your people to leave, or are you expecting to retain them? And that's obviously what we talk about a lot with our clients when we're looking at the reward principles and how people decide within an organization, how you decide how to pay people, and are you looking for that longer term? Because then that will lead into or come out of your other strategies around learning and development and recruitment.
And
how
pay
much do you want to
progression.
pay, and how do you pay progress? Exactly. How do you
Yeah.
progress both pay and career?
I think that's the big, because you can't. It's very difficult to talk about pay and having pay structures without really thinking about career and career progression, because those two things are very much linked. And when you look at reasons why a lot of people are leaving organizations, one of the most common reasons is, career progression. I'm looking to progress my career. But the fact is, they're not just going for career progression, right? There is a pay rise that comes with that. And so maybe that is the main reason, pay, or maybe it's a combination of the two. But I think that's why it's maybe this whole succession planning process needs to be a lot more formal in some organizations rather than just stuff that's happening in isolation in different areas. And I think it also needs to be linked more closely to the reward process, because it's very much around career development and progression and making people understand the opportunities that are available, but also how their pay will progress if they do get those opportunities.
Yeah, I suppose when Steph was talking about grow, collaborate, execute, that all of that measure of future potential, it made me think quite a lot of how you measure how someone progresses through their pay range and how you decide where someone might sit. So if they're all lined up hand in hand, so to speak, you get a much better result for the organization, I think.
Yeah, I think that that point around grow, lead, collaborate, execute. That's a really interesting aspect of like you said, around pay progression and where you might sit within the range, because you would expect to be growing, leading, collaborating, executing if you are at the higher end and ready to move on to the next stage in your career. It's just, I think those elements of that's what was specific to them: grow, lead, collaborate, execute. But they might be very different in another organization. It might not be around, executing. It might be around innovation, for example, or collaborators, teamwork. But it might be around specific behaviors. So that's going to be different for each organization, but it's very much defining There's a very clear link to pay and pay progression here. What did you think about the aspect of so when he talked about there's two things that they look at. Do you have the right skills to do this next job? And do you have the aspiration to do it? And I think skills is something that has been done by organizations for a long time. Some do it more formally. But the other aspect is very difficult to measure. One is difficult to measure, but also it was interesting when you talked about the difference between ambition and aspiration. And what is your view on that around ambition being perceived as self-serving and aspiration is around growth, but not coming at the expense of someone else? I mean, is it just semantics or is there really a difference?
No, I think so. I actually wrote down the definition of aspiration or what they were looking for, and it was a deep sense of purpose aligned with the company values, and do they demonstrate the right aspirations for the organisation and their clients, versus the ambition, which, like you say, would be about their own ambitions, which may not actually align with the values of the organisation. And I think that's a fair comment. You know, I've heard of people who they're focused on the job title. They want to move up, not because of aspirations within the organisation, but so that the job title matches a higher level, so that when they're on the market and externals are looking at them, they've got this job title. Well, that's a selfish ambition, which they're, you know, within their right to have. But for an organisation, you want that one wants to learn and grow and lead in your organisation, and it identifies with the purpose and the mission of your organisation. So if you could find a way to measure that and focus on those people, surely that's a good thing. And I'm certainly interested in what the set of questions would be that they do ask about aspiration. I'd like to see them, but I think good.
Yeah, I think either way, thinking about the way aspiration, you do still get people who want to climb the corporate ladder, like a little bit similar to what you just said, Tracy, if I was like chasing the next job title. But their ambition is to climb the corporate ladder and become a VP or whatever it might be. There's a mismatch there between the aspiration of having leadership within the organization that matches the values of that organization and an individual who just wants to be more senior because they want to be more senior. So I was just thinking about how you objectively measure aspiration, because it could change over time depending on how the organization grows or changes. So it needs to be mindful of how things might have moved and where the strategy for the organization as a whole might have moved. If you're merged or you've been acquired, or there's lots of different variables.
What is wrong with someone who may want to become more senior in their organization? They want to get a more senior role, as long as it doesn't come at the expense of, I mean, ultimately all of this comes at the expense of, because you've got three people going for the same job, one person's going to get it, and two people will lose out. But what is wrong with somebody having that ambition of, I want that senior role, as long as I just do the best that I can, rather than trying to, you know, make sure that the other two people don't get it. So doing it in the right way, what's wrong with that ambition?
But is that not ambition with aspirations? So that's someone
Yeah.
that's having ambition, but aligning with the aspiration of what you could do in that role in this organization, versus I just need to move up in my career. To me, there's nothing wrong with ambition, but it's finding the aspirational piece in that ambition, versus it just being I'm on this linear track and I just want to move up for me and not see where my place is in the company and what I can do for the company. What can I do for my clients if I was given that role?
I think that you've got if you've got an ambition rather than an aspiration, that is off. Well, that's where I have seen people being promoted, not necessarily beyond their ability, but something that does make it harder to have that. That individual won't necessarily have the aspiration to improve or to do and align with the company's values. You tend to see more, poor management because of an individual's ambition. If you're thinking about an aspirational leader, then they're more likely to add value, I think.
I want to bring everyone.
Yeah.
Bring everyone along with them, I guess.
Yes.
But isn't that the difference between, I guess what I see this as the difference between a leader and a very good leader, right? But realistically, there are a lot of people that just might see their job as a job, and it's not, look, I'm here for the rest of my career working for this company. What can I do for this company? It's, I want to grow and develop into the next role, and maybe in 3 years' time, I might look to move elsewhere and I take those skills elsewhere. So I think it's almost like this is the ideal scenario where we want that aspiration, and how you align your personal goals with the goals of the organization, but recognizing that not everyone wants to do that. And we shouldn't necessarily just disregard those people because they're thinking, I do want to develop in my career and contribute, but maybe I'm not looking to do this for the next 10 years.
Isn't that down to the organisation though? So if you've got an organisation, and I can't remember how big Mustafa's organisation was,
90,000.
but 90,000. So I think when you've got a pool that big, you can have high expectations of your success, who you're going to place in your succession plans. Maybe, in certain levels of the organisation, it's not so much you can cope with someone who's only going to be there 3 years. But when you're talking about your senior leaders, I think you probably want some stability as well. So you're hoping that you're going to get people that are going to move into those positions for a significant amount of time.
And to follow a strategy through. So if you've got a 3 to 5 year strategy, you want someone to follow through on the 3 to 5 year strategy. Yeah. It's just it's very subjective though. That's, I guess, my main reflection is how do you turn that essence into a question and answer process?
Yeah, I mean, he did mention that it's a very difficult thing to measure, and I still don't have a clear idea of how you can do that meaningfully. But I guess the other question is also, do you really need to have that aspiration in order to? So if you think about, some managers could end up being very good managers, and they only end up in the role because they were good at their job, right? I mean, that's also why we end up with bad managers, because they're good at the job, they get promoted and given responsibility for managing a team. And they take on that responsibility because that's the only way to progress your career, that you have to take on people management. And that leads to some really bad managers, but it can also lead to good managers. But they didn't necessarily have the aspiration to be leaders. They had an aspiration to be good at their job and what they do. So the question is, again, should we be disregarding or not considering people that don't have the aspiration but are just good at their job?
I think it's a question, and I think that to ask the employee themselves. And I think it goes back to the piece that you were talking about with EDI and how, certain groups may not be going for some of the roles, and maybe they've never felt that they could have the opportunity to have that aspiration. So that might just be one of the reasons. So for me, I think there's a way of questioning and understanding what an employee wants, and they might think they don't have the aspiration to do the roles, but actually when you delve deeper in there might actually be some aspiration in there. It's just that they've never thought that this is for them. So there could be a reason.
Yeah, social mobility is something that if you're bringing out people who have not had aspiration and have been taught not to have aspiration and tell them that they can, then yes, it's hard to measure, but it's something that assists in social mobility, diversity, inclusion. Yeah.
I think some of this is, is in a lot of performance conversations, career conversations, so basically annual review conversations, different organisations, they will have a what's your career aspirations piece in there. And I think it's sometimes down to the quality of that person's manager and their coaching skills to actually help an employee have that conversation about where they want to go in the career, what are their opportunities, and could then create that ambition and aspiration in somebody. So like you say, somebody might not have thought that they could be a good people manager, but there are certain skills that lead to good people management, and a good coach would be able to identify those in a person and help them hone in on those skills. So I think it's all about coaching and development throughout the organisation.
So I'm trying to think about now. We've looked at the different aspects of succession planning, what was discussed, and how can we practically do this in an organization of a much smaller size that don't have their formal processes. And from what you're saying, I think it seems like a lot of it does come down to the managers and the leaders. And in the same way, for example, we we have a very specific training on how to have pay conversations with people in your team. It feels like there needs to be specific training on how to look at succession planning in your team and coaching and developing people, because again, it comes back to that point of a lot of people become managers because they're good at their job and they get put in that position. But these are all the things that we don't really train them on. So is that the answer, that there needs to be training on line managers on how to manage succession planning, or does there need to be something more formal given to managers on how to manage the process?
I think, like we said, it was an idea to look at how pay progresses and how planning for succession happens at the same time. That if there's an understanding on how to have pay conversations, the ability to coach and grow your line report will come as a part of that. It is so driven in culture, though. So if you've got a different approach happening at a different plate in different parts of the organisation, it's very hard to think about how you plan for succession.
So I don't know how formal we class as formal, but I think that there should be opportunities for managers to have this conversation with their leadership or the broader leadership, because when we do calibration sessions with our clients, so by calibration sessions, I mean when we're actually having a look at their organisational structure and we're looking at their career framework and where roles sit within the career framework, we are trying to tell them we're talking about a role here and not an individual. But my goodness, the managers love to talk about the individuals. And in that session, we're having to rein them back in, but they'll use that opportunity because they're sat with HR and another person talking about their roles. And at that point, they'll start talking about this individual and they're doing this and they could move on to this, or they could be doing that, or they could. So managers do want to talk about this. So whether it's formal or informal, I think managers do want to talk about succession planning. They do want to talk about the growth of the people in their team. So I think that you need to create the environment for that to happen, because you can certainly see them enjoying it when we have sessions on a completely different, topic.
Yeah, no, I agree because I remember those conversations from a lot of calibration sessions. But is it also the fact that in a lot of organizations, managers are just thinking about their team, and it's not that overall organizational view? And so when you do talk about people and the skills they have and how they could contribute a lot more, a lot of managers are thinking, well, I don't want to lose this person. And actually, a lot of the times, if it's a case of somebody moving internally in 2 months' time and finding a good job, or moving in 6 months' time, leaving the company to go elsewhere, managers might go with the 6 month option of leaving the company because they're thinking, I'm going to lose this person anyway. I'd rather keep them for 6 months than 2 months. And I don't know if there's a lot of that mindset where we need to, coach our managers to say, you need to first think about what's best for the company and not just short term. And it's just having a slightly longer term view around our people and succession rather than short term results.
I think that's a culture thing as well. I think, there's certainly many organisations where it's part of the culture to build and grow their employees. So the leaders in those organisations, I think, would be concentrating on the growth of their employees and not a tactical approach to how long can I keep them for.
And how long can I keep them in this role because they're doing a really good job in that role and I don't want to replace them in that role. And it's not about the growth of that individual. It's about, well, it would be a headache for me to replace them because they're doing the job of two people. So it needs to be encouraged. It's top down, or it's just not. It's built up for failure. I think you can say we've got a strong succession planning initiative, and just use it as a tick box exercise, or you can actually implement it from a top down. Everyone does this. This is our approach. This is how we do it here.
I was trying to think of what other films has succession planning in, and all I could think of was Willy Wonka, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. all he decides to do was send out some golden tickets and then put them through an assessment day and decide who his successor was.
Well, I know it's not a film, but you've got the whole Office episode, the US Office.
The golden tickets.
No, not that one. The one where he takes them all to the lake. Michael takes them to the lake and he tries to judge who might be the best manager candidate by making them walk across, do games, sumo wrestling, and who wins gets the job. Interesting technique for succession planning.
There was the hot dog eating contest as well.
Yeah.
And I guess you could say that maybe is one way to find out if somebody has aspiration or ambition. Because if you're willing to do those things to succeed, then you really have aspiration. Yeah. Thanks, Tracy and Philippa, for your insights. I hope you enjoyed the episode on succession planning with Mustafa and what they're doing at Standard Chartered. I really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone listening did. If you have any questions for that episode, please do send them across, and I will try my best to pass them on to Mustafa for him to answer them. If there are any other topics that you would like us to cover in future episodes as well, please do send us an email, podcasts@acaseofthemondays.com. Till next time, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll speak to you soon.